This is a recording for the feedback on the little test on race that some of you completed last week, and you can still complete it this week. But the purpose of the recording and to give you feedback on the test is to highlight the importance of concepts in tests. And even though you're asked to explain the concept in the little test you took, the upcoming test 1 is multiple choice questions only. And I can see from the way that some of the concepts are tackled that it is concepts you need to pay attention to, and particularly the readings. The readings are going to help you for the test. Multiple choice questions are designed around readings, content of readings. And so that is what is incredibly important about next week's test. There are no short questions and answers. They are only multiple choice questions. The actual format of the test, the way it is structured, is shared in this discussion already, so please refer to the notes above. But I just wanted to illustrate to you how you go about using the readings, doing the readings, please, before the test in order to tackle the actual test, because the concepts are embedded in these readings. So I'll start with the Greenstein reading and some of the questions that you were asked. Greenstein looks at the classical approach of race, okay, by Kant and Hegel. And you must listen to the recordings as well that have been produced for these readings. They really help you make sense of the readings. And he takes you through what both of them argued in relation to race. And that, for example, Kant was making the argument that races were not different species, but deviate forms, meaning variants on the same basic human theme. And that really the physical features emerge in response to encounters with diverse geographic and climatic environments. Hegel, on the other hand, looked at the cultural and historical processes related to people living in various parts of the world and what happened to them, how they therefore developed in their own ways, what challenges they tended to face. At best, their approach to race is considered as Eurocentric rather than racist, because even though they assumed, and that is Eurocentrism, that Europe enjoys mental and technological superiority in relation to most other cultures and civilizations, it does not regard that superiority as the outcome of physical differences, in other words, race. So it's not racist. Okay, so it's important to really read deeply into these readings and to be able to extract the correct meaning of the concept so that you arrive at the appropriate and correct answer. Then there is a question on Marx and race, which is also covered in the Greenstein reading. And you can see here very clearly that Marx has a materialist conception of history, theory. He looks at the rise of capitalism, which is crucial to modern race relations. So as soon as you see capitalism, what you understand by that is class, right? Class relations. Economic systems, the ownership of private property. But what Marx emphasizes always in class relations and in race relations is oppression, violence, and coercion. Okay, and that is what is key to his theory, to his materialist conception of history, is the oppression that accompanies class relations and race relations. And therefore, here you see that very clearly in this bullet point that racial distinctions were used to facilitate the exploitation that is already there, right? So it enhances it, it exacerbates it, of the exploitation of the workers who suffer from poor working conditions and low pay. So that is, if you like, what race relations are based on, the exploitation of labor. Yes, so very important to pay attention to these readings. Then you look at the next section, which is the consciousness of Du Bois, the consciousness of race, Du Bois, Fanon, and Biko. And you had a question on double consciousness. And you can see here very clearly that double consciousness is a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others because of having to deal with their prejudice and bigotry. So it's important that you do get the the concept right and the definition, therefore, of the concept correct. Of course, there will be questions on Du Bois, Fanon, and Biko in the test. Okay, so that is the Fanon reading, the Greenstein reading. I would like to show you the Ratanzi reading. Okay, so therefore, let's look at the Ratanzi reading next. You have got some concepts, or please read through the entire reading. It's so incredibly important because the concepts are embedded in these readings. You had a question on whiteness and what it is. And you can see it's very much covered in this particular paragraph because remember the question was, it's about identity, and Blackness is about identity. So what the question was is, what is whiteness, and how does Ratanzi address this? What is his take on it? And he says here very clearly that he's talking about it in the US context. It's about, you can see there, USA. It's about immigrant groups like the Jews, the Italians, and the Irish, who were not considered white. Okay, when they came to America, they were not considered as belonging to the white races. The Irish were considered as black, and the Italians had this ambiguous status between being white and black. So how did they therefore become white or be considered as white? Because you can see here the whiteness of Jews and the Italians and the Irish was achieved in the 20th century. How? As part of a social and political process of inclusion. In other words, when they entered, they weren't considered as white. They didn't have a white identity. They didn't hold this identity either, because they came from parts of the world where that wasn't key to their identity, skin color, or understanding the relations between physical appearances and political processes, right? Or knowing that there was those connections. Those connections existed in the USA. How did they achieve this whiteness? How did they, through what processes? When they talk about social and political processes of inclusion, it means they became powerful. They moved into powerful positions in American society, in American politics, for example. So that is why it is a process, and it's a process of inclusion. So it's really important to understand its concepts and to read really deeply into them. You have another question on the noble savage. What does this refer to? And you've got some reading to do because it starts really in this section, chapter 2. And then you need to move on to wildness and blackness in the European imagination, and to really get the basis or the kind of foundation for the noble savage term. And you see that this is really related to imaginations and to thinking about others, not really knowing if this is the case or not. And then you start to see it emerge in chapter 3 through the Indians encounter Columbus. As you know, he was on his way to the Indies. What was he looking for? Wealth. And then you see Ratanzi say on page 10, one of the lessons of the history of race is an appreciation of the extent to which European colonizers saw not the cultures of the colonized as they were, but as they expected them to be. So Columbus was a European colonizer. He believed in the one-eyed and men with tails and mermaids. And this is what his imagination, right, held for him. So therefore, when he came across the Indians, what he saw, not what was there, but what he saw through his imagination was primitive people, unclothed and dark. Now that's derogatory, that's negative, but he also saw them as close to nature, right? And therefore that is not derogatory, that is therefore the opposite of derogatory, yes? That's what he saw. Doesn't mean that that was what was there. Remember, the point is it's what they saw, not what they expected them to be, not what was really there. So there is this duality to war, and that's what the term noble savage, please go on to page 12, refers to, this duality. The noble savage, the other, was regarded as characterized by, here's the positive side, freedoms. They had freedoms from clothes, private property, hierarchy, subordination, sexual taboos, religion. This added up to a perfect state of nature. That's the positive side. The negative side, okay, was seeing the other as in terms of bestiality and savage, right? So that is negative. That is an absolute negative part of it. So that is what the term noble savage refers to. And it's how others were perceived, not as they were, but how they thought they were. Okay, so another important section in the Ratanzi readings is on the science of race. This is known as scientific racism. And a whole number of important points are made here, that it's in the 19th century that this theory of race emerges. The so-called science of race, it's a pseudoscience, but it's the science of race, scientific racism, theories that do what? They try to explain all human variation on the basis of innate racial characteristics. Now, as you know, what is distinct about the 19th century is that this is the era of imperialism. You know this from your Cooper reading, right? Colonization. And therefore, you see these books being published. So this is linked to the publication of books as culture, okay? So books on race. So these are cultural products during the imperial period in the 19th century, where the science of race rises, okay? So what did it do? It tried to prove the inferiority of Black and yellow populations, finds scientific justification for the inferiority of women as well. Okay, so those really are the readings, the main points I'd like to make from that little test on race that you may have taken, and here's my feedback on it. But the most important points I'd like to make are the following. To tackle the test next week, you need to read the readings. They will help you. They are multiple choice questions only. Okay, therefore, what was written for the assignment is a different test. It's a different way of assessing you. Okay, so feedback on the assignment isn't critical to your performance in the test. Critical to your performance in the test is you reading the readings, listening to the lecture slides, and listening to the recordings that accompany the readings, because in there lies both the essence of the questions and the answers to the questions. So please read carefully and listen carefully to the resources that have been provided.